As of April 5, 2026, 11 a.m. New York time, something has already begun. Not officially, not publicly, but operationally. Because 72 hours before this moment, Iran didn't just issue another vague warning. It named targets, U.S. and Israel-linked campuses, civilian-adjacent infrastructure. That's not noise. That's targeting language. And when targeting language appears, it means one thing. Someone somewhere has already calculated impact zones. Now here's where it gets worse. Within the first 24 hours after that threat, multiple proxy groups across at least 3 separate regions shifted posture. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Missile units repositioned. Drone launch capabilities went active. Communications traffic spiked. This wasn't escalation for attention. This was preparation for execution. At approximately 3:40 local time in the region, intelligence signals picked up movement patterns that didn't match routine readiness drills. Short-range systems were aligning with high-value zones, not military bases, mixed-use areas. That's the problem, because when proxies start aligning like that, it creates a pressure system. Not a single point of failure, but multiple triggers waiting for activation. And the United States saw it, not as a threat, but as a countdown. Now normally, in situations like this, you get a delay, diplomatic signals, de-escalation language, time bought through ambiguity, but this time, that didn't happen. Instead, within that same 24-hour window, something else moved, quietly, without announcement, and far faster than expected, an entire Marine Expeditionary Unit. Now understand what that means. This isn't a small deployment. A standard Marine Expeditionary Unit carries over 2,200 Marines, integrated, self-sustaining, air, ground, and logistics combined into a single rapid response force. But this wasn't just any unit. This was the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, and they weren't moving into a safe zone. They were entering one of the most unstable choke points on Earth. That changes everything, because choke points are not just geographic. They are pressure amplifiers, narrow corridors where even a small miscalculation can trigger disproportionate consequences. And now you have over 2,000 personnel entering that space. At the exact moment proxies are activating, at the exact moment threats become specific. This is where things shift, because once both sides begin moving at this speed, the timeline collapses. What should take weeks starts happening in hours. What should remain theoretical becomes operational, and what should stay contained starts leaking outward. But here's what most people are missing. This wasn't a reaction. The speed of this deployment suggests something else entirely. Pre-positioning. Because moving a Marine Expeditionary Unit with integrated air assets into theater is not something you improvise in 24 hours. It requires staging, logistics, routing, coordination across naval and air command structures, which means the decision was likely made before the threat became public. And if that's true, then the timeline we're seeing is not the beginning, it's the middle. Now compare that to Iran's position. On one side you have distributed proxy networks, flexible, low-cost, hard to attribute. On the other, you have a centralized, highly mobile, technologically advanced force entering a defined battle space. Static pressure versus dynamic insertion. And dynamic forces move faster. That's the contrast. Iran's proxies can threaten multiple points, but they cannot reposition at the speed of an amphibious strike group carrying vertical launch aircraft. So the balance starts to shift. Not completely, but enough. Because once mobility enters the equation, unpredictability increases. And unpredictability is what breaks deterrence. Now the situation changes. Because at this point, both sides are no longer signaling. They are positioning for what comes next. Iran is holding pressure across multiple fronts. The United States is inserting a force designed to act immediately. And when both of those things exist at the same time, silence doesn't mean calm, it means execution windows are opening. Within the next 72 hours, something has to give. Either the pressure releases, or it breaks. And if it breaks, it won't stay contained, because what comes next is already in motion. And this is just the beginning. By the time most people even noticed the headlines, the deployment was already complete. Not announced, not debated, just executed. Within roughly 24 to 36 hours of Iran's threat becoming specific, the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit had entered operational range. That kind of speed isn't normal. Even in high-readiness scenarios, large-scale deployments usually stretch over several days. This one didn't, and that's where the real shift begins. Because this wasn't just about putting Marines into a volatile region. This was about what came with them. This wasn't just any aircraft, it was the F-35B Lightning II, a fifth-generation strike platform with stealth capability and, more importantly, short takeoff and vertical landing. That means it doesn't need a traditional runway. It can launch directly from amphibious assault ships. In simple terms, it turns a ship into a floating airbase. Now think about the implications. An F-35B carries a combat radius of roughly 800 to 900 kilometers. That places multiple high-value zones within immediate reach the moment it enters theater. No delay, no staging from land bases, no warning buildup, just instant operational capability. That's the problem, because before this deployment, any potential strike scenario had friction. Aircraft needed bases. Bases needed protection. Timelines were predictable. Now that friction is gone, and when friction disappears, response time collapses. At approximately 11:20 p.m. local time, reports began confirming air elements were active. Not conducting strikes, not yet, but flying patterns consistent with reconnaissance and airspace mapping. Within hours, not days. That's not symbolic, that's operational. Now compare that to Iran's side. Their strength lies in distributed systems, missiles placed across multiple regions, drones deployed in layered networks. Flexible, yes, but largely static once positioned. The US just introduced mobility at scale, fast versus fixed, and fast always dictates tempo. This is where it becomes dangerous, because tempo control means one side decides when things happen, and the other side reacts, and once you are reacting, you are already behind. But here's what most people are missing. This deployment doesn't just enable strikes, it enables options, and options are power. With an amphibious-ready group supporting the MEU, you're not just looking at aircraft, you're looking at a fully integrated force. Marines ready for rapid insertion, equipment preloaded, air cover available instantly. A standard amphibious-ready group typically includes multiple ships carrying helicopters, landing craft, and command systems. Combined, they create a self-contained operational ecosystem, no reliance on local infrastructure, no need for permission. That changes everything, because now the United States is operating independently inside a contested zone, not waiting, not negotiating access, already there. Now let's break the timeline. 72 hours before, Iran escalates threats. Within the first 24 hours, proxies shift. By the second day, U.S. forces are not just moving, they are arriving, and by the time we reach T0, the system is live. Aircraft in range, Marines in position, command structures active. That's a full transition from warning to readiness in under 3 days. That speed is the signal, not the deployment itself, because speed tells you intent, and intent, in this case, is not passive. Now the situation changes, because once F-35Bs are in the air, every potential target inside that 800 to 900 kilometer radius becomes part of the equation. Visible targets, hidden targets, mobile targets, everything. And Iran knows that, which creates a paradox. The more visible the U.S. presence becomes, the more pressure builds on Iran's side to respond or risk losing deterrence credibility. But responding carries risk, because any direct action against U.S. assets triggers escalation. And escalation at this level doesn't stay contained. So now Iran is caught between two timelines. Act too early, and you trigger immediate retaliation. Wait too long and you lose initiative. That's the trap. And traps don't need to be closed. They just need to exist. This is where things shift again, because the presence of advanced aircraft and rapid deployment forces doesn't just deter, it compresses decision-making, from days to hours, from strategic planning to immediate reaction. And in compressed timelines, mistakes happen, misreads happen. And once a mistake happens in a high-density military environment, it doesn't stay small, it multiplies. Now consider the broader scale. You're not dealing with one front. You're dealing with at least 3 active proxy zones, multiple missile ranges overlapping, drone corridors already active, and now a mobile strike force layered on top of that. This is no longer a linear conflict, it's a network, and networks are unpredictable. One node triggers, others react, sometimes without coordination, sometimes without control. That's why this deployment matters, not because of what it has done, but because of what it enables. Immediate action, multiple options, and rapid escalation if something goes wrong, and they couldn't stop it, because by the time anyone realized how fast this was happening, it was already in place. Now both sides are inside the same operational window, same time frame, same pressure, same proximity, and that's when proximity becomes the real risk, because distance creates safety, proximity creates accidents. And accidents in this environment don't stay accidents, they become events, and events trigger responses, and responses trigger escalation, and everything accelerates from here. At this point, it would be easy to assume this is just another display, a show of force, a message, but that assumption breaks down the moment you look at the timing, because displays don't move this fast, and they don't arrive fully operational. Within less than 48 hours, this deployment didn't just enter the region, it integrated. Air patrols began, command structures synchronized, surveillance cycles activated. That's not signaling, that's execution readiness, and that's where the real danger begins. Because once a system is fully operational, it doesn't need additional approval cycles to act. It's already in position. This is where things shift. Now go back to the timeline. 72 hours before, Iran escalates threats. Within 24 hours, proxies adjust. By hour 48, U.S. forces are not just present, they are active. And by T0, the system is live. That's a complete cycle. Threat, positioning, activation, less than 3 days. That's the compression. And compressed timelines remove buffers. Normally, there's space between stages. Time to interpret signals, time to clarify intent, time to de-escalate. Here, that space is gone. That's the problem. Because without that buffer, every movement gets interpreted as intent. Every flight path becomes a potential strike. Every radar ping becomes a possible target lock. At approximately 6:10 a.m. local time, surveillance patterns intensified. Not aggressive, not overt, but consistent with mapping operations, identifying terrain, tracking movement, building a real-time operational picture. That's not preparation for diplomacy. That's preparation for action, and they couldn't stop it, because once that data starts flowing, it feeds into systems that are designed to act quickly. Targeting cycles shorten, decision loops accelerate. Now here's the hidden layer, but here's what most people are missing. This deployment isn't just about responding to Iran, it's about controlling the next move. Because when you insert a fully operational force into a contested environment, you force the other side to react to you. You dictate tempo, and tempo is everything. Iran's advantage has always been distributed pressure, proxies operating across multiple fronts, missiles and drones creating constant low-level threat environments, slow pressure, persistent. But now that pressure is being met with speed, fast insertion, immediate readiness, instant reach, that contrast matters, because slow systems rely on time, fast systems remove it, and when time disappears, so does control. Now the situation changes, because Iran now has to calculate not just what it wants to do, but how quickly it can do it. And speed is not its strength. Missiles need positioning, drones need coordination, proxies need signaling. Those processes take time. Meanwhile, the U.S. force that just entered the region is already inside its execution window. That imbalance creates instability, because one side can act immediately, and the other must decide whether it can keep up. This is where it becomes dangerous, because if Iran feels its window is closing, it may act earlier than planned. Not because it wants escalation, but because it fears losing initiative. And early action is rarely precise. It's reactive. Now layer that onto the environment. Multiple proxy fronts, overlapping missile coverage, active drone corridors, and now a mobile strike force moving within that space. This isn't a controlled system anymore, it's a volatile one, and volatility increases the probability of error. One misread, one miscalculation, one wrong signal interpreted incorrectly. And suddenly, the system shifts from tension to action. Now consider the scale again. You have over 2,200 Marines deployed, aircraft with an 800 to 900 kilometer reach, multiple proxy networks active across at least 3 regions, all operating within a compressed 72-hour window. That's density, and density amplifies consequences. Because when everything is close together, reaction times shrink. There's no delay, no buffer, no safe distance, just immediate interaction. Now compare before and after. Before, threats existed but required buildup. After, capabilities are already in place. Before, escalation required coordination. After, it requires a decision. That's the shift. And that's why this is not just a show of force. It's a pre-positioned system waiting for a trigger. Now the critical question becomes, who moves first? Because whoever does sets the chain in motion. And once that chain starts, it doesn't stop at one action. It cascades across systems, across regions, across timelines. This is where everything tightens, because now both sides are aware of the same reality. They are inside the same operational window. They are within each other's reach. And they are both calculating risk in real time. That's when tension peaks, not when forces arrive, but when both sides realize what those forces can do, and what they might already be prepared to do. And that's when silence becomes the most dangerous signal of all, because silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means decisions are being made, and what comes next won't be announced. It will be executed, and that's when the real escalation begins. Up to this point, everything looks like a direct standoff. U.S. forces moving in, Iran issuing threats, aircraft in the air, Marines in position. But that's only the visible layer. The real pressure is coming from somewhere else, and it's already active. Because Iran doesn't operate through a single front, it operates through a network, a distributed system of proxy groups spread across at least 3 major regions, each capable of acting independently but aligned strategically. That's the problem. Because when you don't have a single battlefield, you don't have a single trigger. You have multiple. Now go back to the timeline again. Within the first 24 hours after the threat, proxy activity didn't spike randomly. It shifted deliberately. Drone units moved closer to launch corridors. Short-range missile systems adjusted positioning. Communication patterns increased by measurable margins, not chaotic, structured. At approximately 1:15 a.m. local time, signals intelligence picked up synchronized activity across more than one zone, not identical movements, but coordinated timing. That matters, because coordination across separate fronts means something is linking them, and that link doesn't need to be constant. It just needs to activate at the right moment. Now compare that to traditional military structure. Centralized command, clear chains of control, predictable response paths. That's not what this is. This is a network, and networks behave differently. They don't escalate linearly. They spike, suddenly, unpredictably. That's where it becomes dangerous. Because even if Iran itself does not initiate direct action, a proxy group can. And once that happens, attribution becomes complicated. Was it ordered? Was it autonomous? Was it a test? That ambiguity slows response decisions, but not by much. Because when U.S. assets are already inside the same operational space, even a small incident becomes significant. Now layer that onto the current situation. You have over 2,200 Marines deployed. F-35B aircraft covering an 800 to 900 kilometer strike radius. Amphibious assets capable of rapid insertion. And surrounding that, drone networks, missile placements, multiple proxy actors, all within overlapping range. That's density at scale, and density creates friction. Now here's the contrast. The U.S. system is centralized and fast. The proxy system is decentralized and persistent. Fast versus everywhere. One hits hard, the other keeps pressure constant. And when those two systems collide, it doesn't resolve quickly, it escalates. Now the situation changes again, because the battlefield is no longer defined by geography. It's defined by reach. Drone systems don't need proximity, missiles don't need visibility, they just need coordinates, and those coordinates already exist. That's the reality. Because targeting data doesn't appear instantly, it's built over time, which means by the time proxies start moving, they already know where to aim, and they couldn't stop it. Because once those systems are in place, they don't need to wait for perfect conditions, they just need an opening. Now consider the decision pressure. Iran can maintain plausible deniability through proxies, but every proxy action increases risk, because, from the U.S. perspective, intent becomes less important than impact. If a drone strikes near U.S. personnel, if a missile lands within range, response becomes likely. And response in this environment is immediate. That's the trap within the proxy layer. It creates flexibility, but it also creates uncontrollable escalation points. Because not every actor in that network operates with the same timing, or the same restraint, or the same objectives. Some move faster, some act earlier, some act without full coordination. And all it takes is one launch, one strike, one miscalculation. Now the system shifts, because once an event occurs, it triggers response protocols. Air assets scramble, surveillance intensifies, targeting cycles activate, and within minutes, not hours, the situation transforms. This is where things accelerate, because unlike traditional warfare, there's no clear pause between actions. It's continuous. One event feeds into the next, and the next, and the next. Now step back and look at the scale again. At least 3 active proxy fronts. Multiple drone corridors, missile systems overlapping across regions, U.S. forces operating inside that network, all within a 72-hour escalation window. That's not a stable system. It's a loaded one, and loaded systems don't stay stable for long. They release pressure. Now here's the key shift. Up until now, the assumption has been that escalation would come from a major decision, a command, a deliberate move. But in this kind of environment, escalation doesn't need permission. It just needs opportunity, and opportunity already exists. That's what makes this different, because control is no longer centralized, it's distributed. And distributed systems are harder to predict, harder to contain, harder to stop. Now the question is no longer whether something will happen, it's where and when. Because with this many active elements, the probability of an incident is not low, it's rising. And once it crosses a certain threshold, containment becomes impossible. This is where it becomes unstable. Because now both sides are not just watching each other, they're watching everything, every signal, every movement, every anomaly, and reacting faster each time. That's when the system starts to spiral, not instantly, but progressively. And once that spiral begins, it doesn't stay within one layer. It expands across proxies, across regions, across command structures, until it reaches something bigger. And by the time that happens, it's already too late to reverse it. Now take everything we've built so far and compress it into one place, because that's what a choke point does. It forces movement, pressure, and risk into a narrow corridor where there is no room for error. And right now, that corridor is active. This is where things shift again, because a choke point isn't just strategic, it's systemic. It connects multiple layers at once: military routes, trade flows, airspace corridors, surveillance zones, all overlapping within a confined geography, which means when tension enters that space, it multiplies. Now look at the numbers. Roughly 20% of global oil supply moves through key regional choke points in this area. Thousands of vessels pass through annually. On any given day, dozens are inside transit lanes that cannot easily be rerouted. That's the baseline. Now add military presence. You have U.S. amphibious ships operating nearby, aircraft covering an 800 to 900 kilometer strike radius, proxy systems positioned along surrounding zones, multiple actors watching the same space. That's density layered on top of dependency. And that's the problem. Because choke points don't just carry military risk, they carry economic consequence. Now imagine a single disruption, not a full-scale attack, just one incident. A drone misfire, a warning shot interpreted incorrectly, a vessel forced to reroute. Within hours, insurance rates spike, shipping slows, markets react. That's within the first 6 to 12 hours. By the second day, delays start stacking. Supply chains begin to feel pressure. Energy markets shift, not because of destruction, but because of uncertainty. And uncertainty moves faster than damage. Now here's the contrast. Before this deployment, the choke point was tense but stable. After the deployment, it becomes active. Before, threats existed outside the corridor. After, military assets are inside it. That changes everything. Because now any action doesn't happen near the choke point. It happens inside it. And inside means immediate consequence. At approximately 8:30 a.m. local time, increased aerial activity was observed along key transit paths. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but enough to signal presence. And presence inside a choke point is never neutral. It's interpreted, watched, measured. Now layer that with proxy capabilities. Drone systems don't need to close distance. Missiles don't need prolonged setup. They just need access. And choke points provide that, because everything passes through, predictably, repeatedly. That predictability is what makes them vulnerable, and they couldn't stop it. Because once multiple systems begin operating in the same confined space, deconfliction becomes harder, not easier. Every aircraft needs to be tracked, every vessel needs to be monitored, every movement needs to be interpreted correctly. And interpretation under pressure is where mistakes happen. Now the situation changes, because the choke point is no longer just a location, it becomes a trigger zone. Any incident inside it carries amplified consequences. A small event becomes a regional issue. A regional issue becomes a global signal, and global signals trigger reactions far beyond the original event. Now think about the timing. 72 hours of escalation, multiple forces entering the same corridor, economic systems still flowing through it, no pause, no shutdown. Everything continues moving while risk increases. That's instability, because normally systems slow down when risk rises. Here, they can't. Trade must continue. Transit must continue. Military presence must remain. That overlap creates pressure. Now this is where it becomes dangerous. Because when operational and economic systems occupy the same space under high tension, the margin for error drops close to zero. There is no room for misinterpretation, no room for delay, and no room for correction once something begins. Now consider what happens if a single drone enters that space. Not even a strike, just presence. Aircraft react, surveillance intensifies, defensive systems activate. Within minutes, multiple actors are responding to the same unknown. That's how escalation begins, not with intent, but with reaction. And reaction spreads faster than planning. Now expand that across a 24 to 48-hour window. More movements, more signals, more interpretations, each one increasing pressure, each one reducing clarity, until eventually, something crosses the line. And once that happens inside a choke point, it doesn't stay contained, because everything connected to that corridor feels it. Energy, trade, military posture, global perception. That's the scale. Now compare that to a normal conflict zone. Events can be isolated, contained, managed. Here they can't, because the environment itself amplifies impact. That's why this choke point matters more than anything else in this situation. Not because it's contested, but because it's connected. And when connected systems get disrupted, the effects cascade outward, fast, unpredictably, and often irreversibly. This is where everything tightens, because now both sides are not just managing military risk, they are managing global consequence. Every move is heavier, every decision carries more weight, and every mistake becomes more expensive. Now the question is no longer just about conflict, it's about control. Who controls the corridor? Who controls the timing? Who controls the response? Because whoever loses control of that loses far more than a tactical position. They lose stability, and when stability breaks inside a choke point, it doesn't just create tension, it creates shock. And that shock doesn't stay regional. It spreads, and what comes next isn't contained to this corridor. It reaches far beyond it. Now we reach the most unstable point in this entire system, not when forces arrive, not when threats are issued, but when one side decides to act. Because at this stage, action doesn't stay isolated, it triggers chains, and those chains move fast. This is where it becomes dangerous, because both sides are now inside the same operational window, same 72-hour pressure cycle, same compressed timelines, same proximity, and that means the first move doesn't just create an event, it creates a sequence. Now imagine this. At approximately 2:10 a.m. local time, a drone is detected entering a monitored zone, not confirmed hostile, not identified clearly, but moving toward a sensitive area. That's enough, because in this environment uncertainty is treated as risk. Within minutes, surveillance assets lock on, aircraft adjust positioning, defensive systems prepare, and here's where the timeline collapses. A decision that would normally take hours now takes minutes, sometimes seconds. That's the problem, because when decisions accelerate, precision decreases. Now consider the possible outcomes. If the drone is intercepted, that's an action. If it's ignored, that's a risk. If it's misidentified, that's a mistake. All three lead somewhere, and once that first action happens, the system reacts. Air patrols increase, strike readiness levels elevate. Command channels activate across multiple layers. Within the first 6 hours, additional assets reposition, not as escalation but as precaution. But precaution looks like escalation from the other side. That's the trigger, because perception matters more than intent. Now the situation changes again. Iran sees increased activity, more aircraft, more movement, more signals, and has to decide, respond or wait. If it responds, even indirectly through proxies, that creates a second event. If it waits, it risks losing initiative. That's the trap tightening. Now layer in the numbers. Over 2,200 Marines already in position, aircraft covering up to 900 kilometers, at least 3 proxy fronts active, all operating within a 24 to 48-hour escalation window after initial contact. That's density under pressure, and pressure forces decisions. Now think about escalation chains. First action triggers response. Response triggers counter-response. Counter-response spreads across connected systems. Within 12 to 24 hours, what started as a single incident becomes multi-point activity. Drone launches increase. Missile systems shift to active status. Airspace becomes crowded. And crowded environments produce mistakes. That's how escalation grows. Not from one decision, but from multiple reactions stacking together, and they couldn't stop it. Because once the chain starts, each step justifies the next. Now consider the contrast. Before the first move, both sides are calculating. After the first move, both sides are reacting. Calculation allows control, reaction removes it. That's the shift, and once control is reduced, escalation becomes harder to manage. Now this is where tempo becomes critical. The U.S. force operates on rapid decision cycles, fast targeting, fast movement, immediate response capability. Iran's proxy network operates differently, slower coordination but wider reach, fast versus distributed. One escalates quickly, the other spreads escalation outward. Combine those two, and you get acceleration in multiple directions. Now imagine this by the second day, more than one incident, more than one response. Multiple areas experiencing heightened activity, no clear origin point, no clear end point. That's systemic escalation, because now it's not about one action, it's about an environment that's fully active. Now this is where things begin to break. Communication lines get overloaded, signals get misread, intent becomes unclear, and once clarity disappears, every action looks like a threat. Every movement looks deliberate. That's when escalation becomes self-sustaining. Now the key moment. Within 48 hours of the first incident, both sides are no longer deciding whether to escalate. They are managing how far it goes. That's a different problem, because containment requires coordination, and coordination under pressure is fragile. One missed signal, one delayed response, one overreaction, and the system jumps again. Now step back. You started with a threat, then positioning, then deployment, then activation. Now you have interaction, and interaction is irreversible, because once systems engage, they don't go back to zero, they move forward, into consequence, and consequence builds, across hours, across days, across regions. Now the final pressure point, whoever moves first, doesn't just act, they define the pace, and once the pace is defined, everyone else follows, faster than they want to. Faster than they planned, and often faster than they can control. This is where everything converges, because now the system is no longer stable, it's active. And active systems don't slow down on their own, they accelerate, until something forces them to stop, or until they hit a limit. And when that limit is reached, it doesn't create resolution, it creates impact, and by the time that happens, it's already too late to contain it. Now everything comes down to one thing: time. Not in days, not in weeks, but in hours. Because once both sides enter this level of readiness, the window for control shrinks rapidly. What you're looking at is not an open-ended situation, it's a compressed cycle, 72 hours. That's the window where outcomes are decided, not publicly, not diplomatically, operationally. This is where things shift for the final time, because up to now we've been tracking movement, positioning, and pressure. But inside this 72-hour window, those elements convert into decisions, and decisions convert into consequences. Now go back to the timeline. 72 hours before, the threat becomes specific. Within 24 hours, proxies reposition. By hour 48, U.S. forces are active. At T0, everything is in place. Now we move forward. Within the first 6 hours after full activation, surveillance peaks. Air patrols increase. Signal traffic rises across multiple channels. Both sides are mapping each other in real time. No guessing, no assumptions, just live data. That's the problem. Because once both sides have real-time visibility, the margin for surprise decreases. But the pressure to act increases. Now move to the 24-hour mark. By the end of the first day, posture stabilizes, but tension spikes. Not because anything major has happened, but because everything is ready to happen. Missile systems remain in position. Drone networks stay active. Aircraft continue patrol cycles. Nothing de-escalates. That's the signal. Because stability at this level doesn't mean calm, it means locked readiness. And locked readiness is unstable by nature. Now the situation changes again, because by the second day fatigue begins to enter the system. Operators working extended cycles, command centers processing continuous data, decision makers facing constant pressure. That's where errors begin to increase, not from lack of capability, but from overload. And overloaded systems make imperfect decisions. Now layer that onto the numbers. Over 2,200 Marines still deployed. Aircraft maintaining operational reach across 800 to 900 kilometers. At least 3 proxy fronts still active. All sustained over a continuous 48-hour high alert period. That's not sustainable indefinitely. Which means something has to give. Now this is where it becomes critical. Because by hour 48 to 60, the system reaches a threshold. Either de-escalation begins, and escalation at this stage doesn't start small. Because all the tools are already in place. All the systems are already active. All the targets are already identified. There is no build-up phase left. Only execution, and they couldn't stop it, because once the system reaches this level of readiness, stepping back requires coordination from both sides, simultaneously, under pressure, within a narrow time frame. That's rare. Now consider the contrast. Before this window, both sides had flexibility. After this window, both sides are constrained. Before, choices were strategic. After, choices are reactive. That's the shift. And once that shift happens, outcomes become harder to control. Now here's the final layer. But here's what most people are missing. This 72-hour window is not about whether conflict happens, it's about how it happens, contained or expanded. Because even if direct confrontation is avoided, proxy activity can still escalate. Even if major strikes don't occur, smaller incidents can still trigger chains. Even if both sides attempt restraint, the system itself may not allow it. That's the danger. Because at this level, the environment is doing part of the work. Pressure builds, signals overlap, decisions accelerate, until something breaks the pattern. Now imagine reaching hour 72. No major strike, no direct confrontation. Everything holds. That looks like stability. But it's not. It's delayed instability. Because all the elements are still there. All the pressure remains. Nothing has been resolved. It's just been pushed forward. And that creates a bigger problem. Because the next cycle starts from a higher baseline. More tension, more readiness, less trust, faster timelines. Now compare that to the alternative. If something does happen within that 72-hour window, even a limited strike, even a contained incident, the system reacts immediately. Escalation chains activate, responses multiply, and the situation expands. Either way, there is no clean exit. That's the reality. Because once both sides reach this level of engagement, the system doesn't return to zero. It resets at a higher level. Now everything converges here. The deployment, the proxies, the choke point, the first move, all feeding into this final window. And inside that window, decisions are no longer theoretical. They are immediate and irreversible. This is where it becomes final. Because after this point, you don't get to choose the pace anymore. The pace is already set, and once that pace takes over, Everything moves faster than anyone can control. And that's how situations like this don't just escalate. They transform, completely, in a matter of hours. By the time you reach the end of that 72-hour window, you're no longer looking at a decision point. You're looking at a result, not necessarily a full-scale conflict, not necessarily a direct war, but a new state, because something will have changed. It always does. This is where everything converges. All the pressure, all the positioning, all the movement across air, sea, and proxy networks. It doesn't just disappear. It resolves into outcomes. Now here's the reality. There are only two directions this can go: contained or expanding. If it's contained, it means both sides held the line. No major strikes, no irreversible triggers. Systems remain active, but no chain reaction begins. That looks like success, but it isn't stability, because all the conditions still exist. Over 2,200 Marines still positioned, aircraft still covering 800 to 900 kilometers, proxy networks still active across at least 3 regions. Nothing resets, it just pauses. That's the problem, because a paused system under pressure doesn't relax, it builds. Now compare that to expansion. If even one event crosses the threshold during that window, a confirmed strike, a direct hit, a misinterpreted engagement, then the system doesn't pause, it accelerates. Within 6 to 12 hours, responses begin stacking. Air operations intensify, proxy actions increase, missile systems shift from readiness to use. And by the second day after that trigger, you're no longer dealing with isolated events. You're dealing with a pattern. That's escalation. And escalation feeds on itself. This is where it becomes uncontrollable. Because once multiple systems activate at once, coordination starts to break down. Not completely, but enough. Enough for signals to get crossed. Enough for responses to overlap. Enough for timing to misalign. And when timing misaligns in a high-speed environment, mistakes happen. And mistakes don't stay small. Now here's the contrast that defines this entire situation. Before this moment, both sides were trying to avoid losing. After this moment, both sides are trying to control damage. That's the shift, from prevention to management, and management is always harder. Now layer in the global dimension. This isn't happening in isolation. Energy markets are watching. Trade systems are reacting. Allies are recalculating positions. Because when a choke point enters instability, it doesn't stay regional. It signals risk outward. Within 24 hours, you can see fluctuations. Within 48 hours, you start seeing adjustments. Routes shift, costs rise, confidence drops, not because of confirmed disruption. Now this is where most people look for answers. Who wins? Who loses? What happens next? But that's not how systems like this work. Because in highly connected, high-pressure environments, outcomes are shared, consequences spread, and control becomes limited. That's the uncomfortable truth, and they couldn't stop it. Not because they didn't try, but because the system itself was already moving. Now step back one final time, 72 hours. From threat, to deployment, to activation, to potential outcome. That speed is the story, because speed removes control, and once control is reduced, everything else becomes reactive. Now this is the final turning point, because whether this stabilizes or escalates, the baseline has changed. Future conflicts start from here. Higher tension, faster timelines, less margin for error. That's the lasting impact, and it doesn't go away, because once a system proves it can move this fast, it will move this fast again. That's the new reality. And that's what makes this moment different, not just because of what happened, but because of what it enables next. And once that door opens, it never fully closes.